177. That's a number you've already heard today of the number of people who lost their lives on 9/11, not counting the 19 murderers who caused them to lose their lives, and that's what they were. But that number makes this one of the most important and most humbling invitations I've received as a county commissioner to speak. How do you do those people justice? This, and then the opportunity I had to speak at the naturalization ceremony in Southport a few years ago to welcome new citizens, far and away outpace any other opportunity I've had just because of what this day represents. And I want to try to do my best to do justice to those people. As Mayor Bozeman said, also not say the same thing you've heard for 22 years, so I'll put a personal spin on it. To honor those that died or lost loved ones, to honor those who responded that day, some of whom are probably here today, and to honor all of those who have defended our freedom in the military. So with that, first of all, Commander, thank you for the honor and the privilege of being here. I think this is the first time I've been a keynote speaker when there was a congressman on stage, so that's a bit weird. But before I get to the main topic, I do want to say, while I'm not a veteran, my father was a veteran, or is a veteran. He served in the U.S. Army in Korea, and he took a bullet and brought home a Purple Heart. And it's not lost on me that if that bullet had been just a little further off, I might not be here with you today. So I want to thank all the veterans in the room for their service. I see a gentleman with a Korean War veteran hat here. Thank you. But let's give all the veterans a round of applause. Before I look back at 22 years ago, I just want to share the context of how I view things. I believe firmly in my heart that the United States of America is the best country on this planet. It's not perfect, but it's the best nation on this planet. There's a reason people are trying to get into our country and not out. And when I hear the song Proud to Be an American, it's not just a song to me. It's something I truly believe. And I believe in everything that our nation is supposed to represent. And our defining characteristic is freedom. In one word, I can sum it up in freedom. So with that as the context, I'm going to take a look back to that day 22 years ago. And they talk about how clear it was that day. This sky reminds me a lot of how clear New York City was. Like every one of you, I remember exactly where I was and who I was talking to when I heard the news. I was a young business person. I walked up to a coffee shop in Raleigh that I typically would go to network with the older guys than me who had a lot more money than me who hung out there every day. And one of those guys named Bobby Lewis was walking out. He said, "Did you hear what happened?" "No, what happened?" He said, "It sounds like a small plane hit the World Trade Center." That was all he knew at that point. We stood there and just looked at each other for a moment, and I said, "That was not an accident." And I got in my car and I went home. Second plane had already struck the tower by the time that I got home. And like so many of you, unless you were there in New York City watching it in person, I was glued to my TV the whole day. And it really didn't seem real. It's like I knew this was happening, but it seemed surreal, not real. And I had to get my mind around the fact this was a real event happening, not some action movie that I was watching. It was so hard to grasp what was actually happening. So I made a list yesterday of the emotions that I felt on that day, and they came back up as I made this list. The first thing I felt was angry. The nation that I love was under attack, and to put it, excuse the language, I was mad as hell. It was really something that got my blood boiling. But I was also sad and horrified to see the people jumping off the building. To know that when that plane hit, people who just started their day like any other day weren't going to finish it. I was afraid for our nation. Was this just the beginning of a sustained campaign against us? And I do believe that was their intent, and I commend our government leaders at that time for stopping what I believe were planned future attacks. On a very personal level, Commander Pringle mentioned I'm a small business owner. I turned in my incorporation papers for my business that I own today on September 6, 2001. My incorporation date is 9/11/01. So I was very concerned for is my business going to survive this, or am I going to not be able to pay my bills? How am I going to make a living? That brought it to a personal level. Like all of you, I was uncertain about what the future held for America because we can't take this country for granted. And I was really powerless because I wanted to do something, but I had no idea what to do. If you were in the armed services, you pretty much knew what you were going to do, as the mayor mentioned. If you were a first responder that day, you knew what you were going to do that day. You didn't know how it was going to end, but you knew what you were going to do. And then at the end of the day, when I heard the story of Todd Beamer on Flight 93 and the now famous Let's Roll, I was a little bit proud because they stood up and did something. But really, if you combine all of those, I was confused and I was dazed and I didn't know where to go or where to turn. That night, I got a call from a woman at my church saying, a bunch of us are getting together, come over. And we went and just prayed. And I think that was, if you couldn't be on site and you couldn't respond, that was the thing to do. Now, fast forward a couple of weeks later, I was in my Sunday school class at church, and they made an announcement about an outreach mission group going from Raleigh, North Carolina, where I lived at the time, to New York City. It was sponsored by a group called Priority Associates, which I had never heard of, had no idea who they were. Turned out they were the business and professional outreach of Campus Crusade for Christ. I didn't know a soul going on the trip before I went, but I knew that I had to go. And on October the 4th, 2001, we crammed into a 15-passenger van in Clayton, North Carolina that evening, drove past the Pentagon on the way to New York City, so we saw the remains of the damage to the Pentagon from the interstate. We got there early October 5th, and we spent 2 or 3 days on the ground just reaching out to people, talking to the residents of New York City. We distributed a magazine called Fallen But Not Forgotten, produced by the Billy Graham organization as a ministry tool related to help people after the 9/11 attacks. And we came home on October 7th. A few days later, I wrote a pretty detailed article about my experience. And in order to share things that you probably haven't heard over and over, I'm going to pull most of the remainder of my remarks from that article, which I went back and spent several hours rereading last night. The first thing I wrote were a list of just words and phrases that came to my mind after the experience I had in New York City. Unimaginable, incomprehensible, tragically sad, awe-inspiring, but hopeful at the same time. I wrote that the images we saw on television didn't even come close to doing justice to what I was seeing on the ground. And I was there 3 weeks later, and I don't think what I saw did justice to what really happened and to what the first responders saw. It was simply incomprehensible. Again, we were there 3 weeks after the attacks, and an NYPD officer that I spoke with said the temperature inside the pile of rubble was still 1,200 degrees at that point, 3 weeks later. I mean, just the fact that it was still smoldering at that level 3 weeks later was amazing to me. When we went to our hotel room that night and took what started out as a white washcloth and I wiped my face, it turned either brown or black from all the dust. And it really looked like something from a World War II movie. It still didn't even look real. And while the sights were surreal, the dust and the smells were very, very real. I saw one clothing store that the glass had been blown out and all the inventory was still there, covered in dust that had come down that day. The trucks taking load after load after load of rubble out. To see the sight of National Guard military personnel patrolling the streets in America was something I never thought I would see in the manner that I saw them that day. And to look down on the ruins of the World Trade Center from the top of the Empire State Building using the telescope, to me was just something, it really just brought it home. And one of the saddest things we saw before I get to the true human toll were all the cars in parking decks that were left there by people who weren't coming back to get them. Just sitting there covered in dust, waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. To talk about the human toll, we met a number of people while we were on the ground in New York City. And one of the people in my group talked to a lady who I'll call the lady in the lobby. She worked on the 86th floor of one of the towers, but happened to be down in the lobby when the plane struck. So she was, by the grace of God, she was spared. But over 30 of her coworkers immediately lost their lives that day. She had been going to 1 or 2 funerals every day for 3 weeks. That's more than I had been funerals than I had probably been to in my entire life up to that point. And that really struck me. I can only imagine what of an emotional toll that took on her. And, Mayor, you mentioned guilt for how you felt about worrying about your son. I'm sure she felt survivor's guilt and just that toll. Everywhere we went, we saw pictures posted of people who were missing with, please call this number if you see this person. One of the other saddest things I saw were family members standing up holding a sign with a picture of their loved one and an absolute look of desperation in their face, and asking, has anybody seen this person? And then in Grand Central Station, there was a memorial wall, which was basically a large sandwich board covered in those posters. And that was so sad because you knew those people weren't coming back. You knew they weren't coming back. This was 22 years ago, and I read an Associated Press article last night that the article is dated September the 8th, 2023, this year, saying that they had just identified the remains of 2 more victims from the World Trade Center 22 years later. That's how long this has been going. I mean, that blew my mind, and I just pray that those families can find some closure. And I wonder how many more haven't been identified. We had conversations with a lot of the first responders that were working while we were there. The NYPD officers had lost so many coworkers in the attacks, but they didn't have time to mourn because they were still doing a job. They were out there working long shifts, and you could see the strain on their faces. They were tired, probably being very patient with people who've tested their patients, trying to get closer to the ground zero. And others in our group talked with the fire department members who said the same thing. One of, to me, the most compelling images that I saw on the news after 9/11 was the young fireman rushing up the stairs when everyone else was coming down. And I think you all know the image I'm talking about. So I'd like to thank all the first responders here and former first responders. Let's give them a round of applause. I don't think anyone understands your job unless they've done it. The attack also took an emotional toll on the people who lived there that we talked to, even if they didn't lose anyone personally in the attacks. A lot of them we were talking with 3 weeks later, it was the first time they had been able to force themselves to go to the site. It had that much of a traumatic impact on them. And one lady described it very eloquently. She said she had basically watched the Twin Towers being built from her apartment terrace 30 years earlier, and she equated it to the loss of 2 children. She said, I watched them grow up and now they're gone. So that was their city's identity, and they didn't feel safe there anymore. They didn't feel safe in their own city. But what I did see, and this was referenced in the opening prayer as well, and some other comments, was everybody in New York wanting to do something to help. And I think that's what sets America apart from the people who want to attack us, is everybody here wanted to band together and do something to help. I had a friend from a small town in North Carolina who started his job at a Manhattan law firm September 10th, 2001. So this guy from a small North Carolina town is in Manhattan with no car, because you probably don't need a car there. Thankfully, his office was on the opposite end of Manhattan, but his apartment was destroyed. So this small town North Carolina guy is suddenly homeless in Manhattan with no airplanes flying. What do? A church took him in and put him up for about a month. That just shows, again, what sets us apart. Americans pulled together like I've never seen in my lifetime after that tragedy. And I wrote this statement down while I was sitting here a minute ago. The buildings fell, but Americans rose up. And I think that's, the buildings fell, but Americans rose up. So I'm going to close with a warning, a few lessons, and one final story from the trip. The warning, shortly after 9/11, I was driving down Hillsborough Street in Raleigh, where I lived at the time after college, and I saw an old beat-up vehicle that I honestly don't know how this vehicle was still on the road, but it must have had 100 American flag stickers on it, and flags taped to it and everything else. And I'm like, there goes an American patriot. And I pulled up, and the man driving the car had a turban. I think he was a Sikh or a Hindu, and he had a death grip on his steering wheel and was not making eye contact with anyone. And it really struck me because he was afraid, but he wasn't afraid of the terrorist. He was afraid we would think he was a terrorist just because of the way he looked. So the warning is, we've got to be better than that. That's just something, that image just stuck with me. The lessons I wrote down, while I love our nation and while I believe everybody here does, there are those people in the world who want to destroy it, and they're still out there. The terrorists who attacked us on 9/11 did not discriminate. They didn't care if you were black or white. They didn't care if you were rich or poor, if your accent sounded like mine or like Commissioner Mike Forte, who many of you know, who grew up in the Bronx. I put this in here in case he was here. They didn't care if you were a Yankees fan or a Red Sox fan, or a Carolina fan or a State fan or a Duke fan. And they didn't even care if you were Republican or Democrat. They just wanted to kill you because you live under that flag. The other thing that, if you think about it, they didn't attack a military target. They attacked civilians intentionally. And that's just barbaric. But they also underestimated us. I think they didn't understand our military and our capabilities there. But what they really underestimated was the character of the American people to rise up and stand up and show what we're made of as opposed to being broken in spirit. I mentioned we pulled together. There were flags everywhere. People pulled together to help. And to me, that's the real spirit of what America's all about. Another lesson is that, again, we still face threats and we cannot become complacent. But if we sacrifice our freedom in the name of security, we've actually handed our enemies a victory. If we continue to divide ourselves over petty differences, we make ourselves vulnerable. And if we forget the lessons of 9/11, we are destined to repeat them one day. And, I think people say never forget, and that's in part aimed at the people who passed that day, but never forget those lessons. And so I'll close with one final story. When we were on the way back from New York City, we were just about to D.C., and we came upon a convoy of motorcycles. And every single motorcycle in that convoy had an American flag on it. Some of the flags were so big, I honestly don't know how they didn't tip the motorcycles over. And it went on for miles and miles. I'd say there had to be at least 1,000 motorcycles in that convoy. And it was a diverse group. And there were all kinds of people wearing helmets and all traveling north. And literally, the visual imagery of that literally gave me goosebumps and brought tears to my eyes because it was Americans just uniting just to show their love for this country. About a month later, there was another even more organized convoy similar to that became the beginning of something called the America's 9/11 Ride, I believe is the name of it. Yeah, America's 9/11 Ride. And a friend of mine who lives here in Waterford was actually in that ride. And he said, if you think it looked amazing passing it, you should have been in the Holland Tunnel with 800 Harleys. He said, you will never hear a sound like that in your life. And that's the sound of Americans showing what America's all about. And go home and Google America's 9/11 Ride. It's a great organization. Started out as a motorcycle ride, and now they've raised hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to benefit people who were impacted by 9/11 and other tragedies. And I'll close with this. America came together after 9/11. I pray it does not take another tragedy like this for us to come together again. I pray that we never forget the lessons of 9/11. And the best legacy we can do for those people who died that day is to leave an America that they can be proud of. And that's not going to happen in Washington. I think David will tell you that's a challenge there. But we can do it one community at a time. And I will close with what was the closing art line from my article that I wrote on October 11th, 2001. This was a trip I will never forget. It is an experience for which I am grateful and one which I hope I never have the opportunity to repeat. May God bless America, and may He continue to protect us from such future attacks. Thank you all for being here.